Intermittent fasting has become one of the most discussed health strategies in modern culture. Scroll through social media, step into a gym, or open a medical journal, and you will encounter bold claims about fat loss, mental clarity, metabolic healing, and even longevity. Yet the louder the conversation becomes, the more distorted the understanding seems to be. Many people reduce intermittent fasting to a simplistic idea: skip meals, tolerate hunger, lose weight. But the human body does not operate on crude arithmetic. It operates on signals. It operates on hormones. It operates on adaptive biological programs that were refined over hundreds of thousands of years. If we want fasting to work, we must understand those programs rather than fight them. At its core, intermittent fasting is not about eating less. It is about creating structured periods in which insulin can fall low enough, long enough, for the body to access stored energy. Insulin is not a villain. It is a survival hormone. Every time you eat, especially carbohydrates, insulin rises to escort glucose from the bloodstream into cells. In that state, your body is in storage mode. Energy is being stored, tissues are being rebuilt, and fat burning is largely suppressed. This is normal. The problem is not insulin itself. The problem is constant insulin. In a modern environment where meals, snacks, sweetened beverages, and processed foods appear every few hours, insulin rarely returns to baseline. When the storage signal never turns off, the fat-burning signal never turns on. This is why calorie restriction alone often fails. You can reduce calories while still stimulating insulin frequently. You can exercise intensely while still remaining in storage mode. If insulin does not drop, fat cannot be efficiently mobilized. Intermittent fasting solves this problem not by force, but by absence. By extending the time between meals, the body completes digestion, clears circulating glucose, and gradually reduces insulin levels. Once insulin remains low for a sufficient window, the metabolic environment changes. The body shifts from external fuel dependence to internal fuel utilization. This shift is sometimes called the metabolic switch. It is not dramatic. It is not instantaneous, but it is profound. Let's walk through what actually happens hour by hour when food stops coming in. In the first 4 hours after a meal, you are not fasting in any meaningful metabolic sense. Digestion is still active. Nutrients are being absorbed. Blood glucose is elevated. Insulin is working. Energy from the recent meal is being distributed to tissues. In modern society, many people never leave this phase because another snack or drink restarts the cycle. Extending beyond this window is where the real physiology begins. Between roughly 4 and 8 hours, dietary glucose has largely been used or stored. The body begins relying on glycogen, a stored form of glucose located primarily in the liver. The liver acts as a stabilizer, releasing glucose into the bloodstream to maintain steady levels for the brain and vital organs. Insulin continues to decline gradually. Mild hunger signals often appear during this window, but it is important to understand that hunger at this stage does not signal danger. It signals transition. The body is shifting fuel sources, not entering crisis. By the 8 to 12-hour mark, liver glycogen becomes significantly depleted. At this point, the body activates protective hormonal adaptations. Growth hormone begins to rise. This is critical. Growth hormone helps preserve lean muscle tissue while encouraging the release of fatty acids from adipose tissue. Contrary to common fears, the body does not immediately cannibalize muscle when food is absent. From an evolutionary perspective, that would be catastrophic. Muscle enables movement, hunting, gathering, and survival. Fat, on the other hand, is stored precisely for times of scarcity. The rise in growth hormone reflects an intelligent biological priority. Protect muscle, burn fat. Between 12 and 16 hours, the metabolic switch becomes more evident. Fat cells release fatty acids into circulation. The liver converts a portion of these fatty acids into ketones, which serve as an efficient alternative fuel source, particularly for the brain. As the brain adapts to ketones, many individuals report increased mental clarity and stable energy. This is not a stimulant effect. It is the result of a steady fuel supply that does not fluctuate rapidly, like glucose after high carbohydrate meals. The nervous system often feels calmer. Energy feels smoother. Focus becomes sustained rather than spiking and crashing. When fasting extends beyond 16 hours, deeper adaptations begin to emerge. One of the most studied is the increase in brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF. BDNF supports neuron survival, synaptic plasticity, and learning. While fasting is not a magic solution for cognitive performance, the elevation of BDNF suggests that the brain responds to temporary food absence, not with decline, but with reinforcement. In evolutionary terms, this makes sense. When food is scarce, mental sharpness is an advantage. The brain becomes more alert, not less. Another process that becomes more active during extended fasting is autophagy, a cellular recycling system. Autophagy identifies damaged cellular components, breaks them down, and repurposes the materials to build healthier structures. Constant feeding suppresses this process. Periods without incoming nutrients allow it to function more efficiently. Autophagy is not a trendy buzzword. It is a well-documented biological mechanism recognized in high-level scientific research. While short fasting windows may only modestly stimulate it, consistent time-restricted eating may contribute to long-term cellular maintenance. Beyond cellular repair, fasting also influences inflammation. Chronic low-grade inflammation underlies many metabolic disorders, including insulin resistance and cardiovascular disease. During fasting, as insulin stabilizes at lower levels and digestion rests, inflammatory signaling can decrease. This is not immediate and should not be exaggerated, but over time, consistent metabolic rest may create a less inflammatory internal environment. At this point, it becomes clear that intermittent fasting is not starvation. It is metabolic timing. It is about allowing the body to cycle between feeding and repair, between storage and utilization, between growth and renewal. The problem in modern life is not that we eat, it is that we rarely stop eating. Our biology evolved in cycles of abundance and scarcity. Intermittent fasting simply reintroduces that rhythm in a controlled, intentional way. In the next section, we will address the most persistent fear surrounding fasting, muscle loss, and why, when done correctly, that fear is largely misplaced. One of the most persistent fears surrounding intermittent fasting is muscle loss. It is a logical concern on the surface. If food stops coming in, energy must come from somewhere, and because muscle tissue contains protein, many assume the body will immediately begin breaking it down to compensate. This belief has been repeated so often that it feels intuitively true. But physiology tells a different story. The human body is not careless with its most valuable assets. It is strategic. When food intake pauses, the body does not enter a chaotic dismantling phase. It enters a coordinated survival program. One of the earliest hormonal shifts during fasting is a significant rise in growth hormone. Research consistently shows that growth hormone levels can increase 2 to 5 times above baseline during fasting periods. This is not incidental. Growth hormone acts as a protective signal. It instructs the body to preserve lean tissue while mobilizing fat stores for fuel. In simple terms, it says, protect muscle, use fat. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes perfect sense. Muscle enables movement, hunting, gathering, defense, and escape. Losing muscle during temporary food scarcity would reduce survival capacity. Fat, on the other hand, exists precisely as an energy reserve. It is metabolically expensive to carry muscle. It is metabolically efficient to carry fat for emergency use. When scarcity appears, the intelligent biological choice is to burn stored fat, not dismantle functional tissue. The confusion often arises because people conflate intermittent fasting with chronic starvation or severe caloric restriction combined with inadequate protein intake. These are not the same physiological states. Starvation is prolonged nutrient deprivation without structured refeeding. Intermittent fasting, when practiced correctly, includes regular, adequate nutrition within a defined eating window. The body responds very differently to these conditions. In starvation, protective mechanisms eventually fail. In structured fasting, protective mechanisms are activated. Another important factor in muscle preservation is the shift in fuel utilization. As fasting progresses and fatty acids become the primary energy source, the need for gluconeogenesis from muscle protein decreases. Ketones also play a protective role by supplying the brain with an alternative fuel, reducing demand for glucose production from amino acids. In other words, as fat burning increases, the metabolic pressure to break down muscle declines. This has been demonstrated in metabolic ward studies, where short-term fasting did not produce significant lean tissue loss in healthy individuals. Physical activity further reinforces this protection. When muscle tissue is used, the body interprets it as necessary. Light resistance training or even regular movement during fasting sends a clear signal that muscle must be maintained. The body adapts to demand. It does not voluntarily eliminate functional tissue that is actively engaged. This is why many individuals who combine time-restricted eating with resistance training often improve body composition, losing fat while preserving or even gaining lean mass. That said, context matters. Extremely prolonged fasts without adequate refeeding, insufficient protein intake during eating windows, or aggressive calorie deficits over extended periods can eventually compromise lean mass. Intermittent fasting is not immunity from poor nutrition. It is a timing strategy layered on top of nutritional adequacy. If protein intake is insufficient or if total energy intake is chronically inadequate, muscle preservation becomes more difficult regardless of fasting structure. Understanding this distinction removes much of the psychological resistance to fasting. The body is not fragile, it is adaptive. It was not designed for constant abundance, it was designed for fluctuation. Temporary food absence activates protective and mobilizing systems, not immediate breakdown. The fear that skipping breakfast will cost me muscle is largely a misunderstanding of how hormonal signaling actually works. Once this barrier is addressed, another crucial question emerges. Why do so many people feel exhausted, dizzy, or unwell when they first attempt intermittent fasting? If the biology is protective, why does the experience sometimes feel destabilizing? The answer lies not in starvation, but in adaptation and in electrolyte balance. As insulin levels fall during fasting, the kidneys begin excreting more sodium and water. Insulin has a sodium-retaining effect. When insulin drops, that retention decreases. The result is increased fluid loss, especially in the early stages of fasting adaptation. Many of the symptoms people attribute to low blood sugar are actually related to dehydration and electrolyte imbalance. Headaches, fatigue, irritability, lightheadedness, these often improve quickly with adequate hydration and sodium intake. Water alone may not always be sufficient. In some cases, small amounts of sodium, potassium, and magnesium can help stabilize the transition. Unsweetened tea and black coffee are generally compatible with fasting and may even blunt appetite temporarily, but they do not replace electrolytes. The goal is not to stimulate the system, but to maintain physiological stability while insulin remains low. Another adjustment involves understanding hunger itself. Hunger is not a linear emergency signal. It is rhythmic and influenced by habit, environment, and expectation. If you normally eat at 8 a.m., your body anticipates food at 8 a.m. Ghrelin, often called the hunger hormone, rises in anticipation of habitual meals. If food does not arrive, ghrelin peaks and then declines, often within an hour. Many people misinterpret this temporary wave as proof they cannot fast. In reality, it is a conditioned signal that fades when not reinforced. True physiological hunger builds gradually and persists. Habitual hunger appears suddenly and often disappears just as quickly. Learning to distinguish the two is a critical skill. It transforms fasting from a battle of willpower into a process of observation. Over time, as meal timing stabilizes, hunger signals recalibrate. The body learns the new rhythm. Breaking the fast is equally important. After extended digestive rest, overwhelming the system with large, highly processed, sugar-heavy meals can produce bloating, nausea, and energy crashes. Strategic refeeding supports stability. Moderate protein intake, healthy fats, fiber-rich whole foods, and a controlled pace allow insulin to rise gently rather than spike dramatically. Fasting and nutrition are not competing forces. They are complementary signals. One lowers insulin. The other rebuilds tissue. Together, they create metabolic flexibility. Perhaps the most important principle is consistency over extremity. Biology adapts to repeated, stable signals. A sustainable 16-8 pattern practiced regularly often produces deeper adaptation than sporadic, 2 4-hour fasts followed by overeating. Stressing the system beyond what can be maintained long-term leads to burnout, not transformation. The most effective fasting method is not the longest one. It is the one you can repeat without destabilizing your health or lifestyle. In the next section, we will examine different fasting structures from 16-8 to OMAD and clarify who they are appropriate for, who should avoid fasting altogether, and how to choose a method that aligns with your physiology rather than your ego. Now that we have clarified the biological foundations of intermittent fasting and addressed the most common fears, the next logical step is structure. Not all fasting patterns are equal, and not every method is appropriate for every person. Intermittent fasting exists on a spectrum. The key is not choosing the most extreme option. The key is choosing the option your physiology can adapt to consistently. The most accessible and widely studied structure is the 16-8 method. 16 hours of fasting, 8 hours of eating. For many people, this simply means finishing dinner earlier and delaying breakfast. Much of the fasting window occurs during sleep, which makes adaptation smoother. From a hormonal standpoint, 16 hours is typically sufficient for insulin to fall, glycogen to deplete significantly, and early fat mobilization to begin. It is long enough to initiate metabolic switching, but short enough to avoid excessive stress in most healthy adults. This is why 16-8 often serves as the entry point and, for many, the long-term solution. What makes 16-8 sustainable is not just biology, but practicality. It integrates into work schedules, family meals, and social life without severe disruption. Sustainability is not a secondary concern, it is central. Metabolic benefits emerge through repetition. A moderate fasting window practiced daily produces more stable adaptations than sporadic extended fasts, followed by inconsistency. For individuals who have already adapted to 16-8 and feel metabolically stable, the 18-6 structure represents a gradual progression. By shortening the eating window further, the body spends more time in a low insulin state. Fat utilization may extend slightly, and appetite regulation may improve in individuals who respond well. However, as the eating window narrows, nutritional density becomes increasingly important. With fewer meals, each one must carry sufficient protein, micronutrients, and overall energy to support recovery and lean mass preservation. Jumping into 18-6 prematurely often results in fatigue, not because fasting is harmful, but because intake becomes inadequate. Further along the spectrum lies OMAD, 1 meal a day. On paper, OMAD appears powerful. A prolonged fasting window can maximize time spent in low insulin conditions and sustained fat utilization. In certain contexts, such as short-term fat loss phases in metabolically healthy individuals, OMAD may be effective, but OMAD demands precision. Meeting daily protein requirements, micronutrient needs, and caloric adequacy within a single meal is not simple. For beginners, OMAD often becomes undereating disguised as discipline. Chronic undernourishment is not metabolic optimization, it is stress accumulation. This distinction is critical. Fasting is a timing strategy layered on top of nutritional adequacy. If nutritional adequacy is compromised, the structure collapses. The body does not differentiate between strategic fasting and insufficient intake if total resources fall below physiological needs. This is why escalating fasting duration without assessing recovery, performance, mood, and sleep often backfires. The goal is metabolic flexibility, not metabolic strain. At the far extreme of the spectrum is dry fasting, the elimination of both food and water. Some proponents claim it accelerates fat breakdown or deepens autophagy. However, from a physiological perspective, dehydration introduces additional stressors unrelated to metabolic switching. Reduced plasma volume, increased cardiovascular strain, electrolyte imbalance, and kidney stress become real risks, particularly in individuals with underlying conditions. There is currently no strong scientific consensus supporting dry fasting as superior to water-based fasting for general health. In most cases, it introduces risk without proportional benefit. Responsible health practice requires distinguishing intensity from effectiveness. More extreme does not automatically mean more beneficial. Choosing the appropriate fasting structure depends on several variables: metabolic health, activity level, stress load, sleep quality, and psychological relationship with food. A sedentary individual with insulin resistance may respond well to time-restricted eating combined with whole food nutrition. A high-performance athlete with demanding training may require shorter fasting windows to preserve recovery and hormonal balance. There is no universal prescription. Biology is individual. Equally important is understanding who should not fast. Intermittent fasting is a tool, not a moral badge or a measure of willpower. Certain populations require continuous or more frequent nourishment due to physiological demands. Pregnant and breastfeeding women represent the clearest example. During these stages, energy and micronutrient requirements are elevated to support fetal and infant development. Introducing prolonged fasting windows can disrupt stable energy delivery. In this context, biological consistency outweighs metabolic experimentation. Individuals with a history of eating disorders require particular caution. Fasting, even when framed as health optimization, can reawaken patterns of restriction, control, or obsession. For these individuals, meal regularity and psychological stability take priority over metabolic timing strategies. Professional supervision is essential if fasting is considered at all. People with insulin-dependent diabetes must also approach fasting under strict medical guidance. Adjusting meal timing while using exogenous insulin can create dangerous blood glucose fluctuations. Hypoglycemia is not theoretical, it can be life-threatening. Similarly, children, adolescents, and underweight individuals are generally not appropriate candidates for structured fasting. Growth, development, and tissue building require regular nourishment. Intentional restriction during these stages can impair long-term outcomes. Medication use is another overlooked factor. Many medications require food for proper absorption or to prevent gastrointestinal irritation. Altering meal timing without adjusting medication schedules can reduce treatment effectiveness or increase side effects. Metabolic experimentation should never compromise medical stability. This balanced perspective is what separates responsible health education from trend-driven advice. Intermittent fasting is powerful not because it is extreme, but because it aligns with how the body is designed to operate when applied appropriately. It restores the rhythm between feeding and repair. It reduces constant insulin stimulation. It encourages metabolic flexibility. But it is not universal, and it is not mandatory. When we zoom out, intermittent fasting is less about restriction and more about rhythm. Human physiology evolved in cycles of abundance and scarcity. Modern life has largely eliminated scarcity, but retained abundance. The consequence is chronic insulin elevation, impaired fat utilization, and metabolic rigidity. Reintroducing controlled periods without food does not rebel against biology, it respects it. In the final section, we will bring these concepts together and clarify what intermittent fasting ultimately represents, not a diet trend, but a structured pause that allows the body's built-in intelligence to function as intended. When we step back and look at the full picture, intermittent fasting is not a shortcut, a punishment, or a test of willpower. It is a structured pause, a deliberate interruption in constant input that allows your internal systems to recalibrate. In a world where food is available every few hours and insulin rarely rests, fasting restores contrast, it restores rhythm. The human body was not designed for perpetual abundance. It was designed for flexibility, the ability to switch fuels, to protect muscle, to mobilize fat, to repair cells, and to sharpen cognition during temporary scarcity is not a modern discovery. It is an ancient survival program. Modern science did not invent it, it simply measured it. When applied intelligently, hydrated, nutritionally adequate, and consistent, intermittent fasting becomes less about weight loss and more about metabolic literacy. It teaches you how your hormones respond. It reveals the difference between habit and true hunger. It shifts health from reaction to awareness. And perhaps the most important takeaway is this: health does not require fighting your body. It requires creating conditions where your body can function the way it was designed to. Intermittent fasting, when chosen appropriately and practiced responsibly, is not deprivation. It is cooperation between modern knowledge and the biological intelligence that already exists within you. If this breakdown helped you understand intermittent fasting through physiology instead of hype, then you're exactly who this channel is built for. At Health Science Explained, we don't chase trends. We examine mechanisms. We look at hormones, signaling pathways, and adaptive biology so you can make decisions based on understanding, not fear. If you found value in this video, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next deep dive into metabolism, insulin sensitivity, fat adaptation, and long-term health strategy. And if you have questions or personal experience with intermittent fasting, share them in the comments. What fasting window works best for you and why? Remember, real health is not extreme. It is informed, consistent, and aligned with your biology. I'll see you in the next video.